The final bit of cutting I'm going to show you is for the binding. And binding is a small strip of fabric that we use to finish off raw edges on the inside. It's a really nice detail. And this binding is stripy, and I love to use a stripe or a check for binding. It's absolutely not necessary, but it does look really nice. It adds a little extra something to the finishing. I've got my fabric here in front of me. This is a pinstripe, the same one I've just shown you. And we're going to cut this on the bias. So our grain line is in direction with the stripe, and you can see that that's quite sturdy. Our cross grain, which is perpendicular, has a little bit more give, but our bias grain, or our bias line, has a real good bounce to it. And that's how we're going to be cutting this bit of fabric. To find our bias, it's really easy with a stripy fabric, but if you don't have a stripy fabric, that's fine. I'd just cut a small section into a perfect rectangle or square and cut in direction with the grain, so you have a nice parallel piece of fabric here. To find the bias, all I'm going to do is bring this edge bit of fabric up like this to meet the top, and that's our bias line. What I'm going to do here is hold it flat with one hand and just use my scissors to cut up that line. And we've got two starting points now for binding. I like to do a 4 centimetre binding because that gives a really nice amount of room once we turn it into 4 parts. We're going to end up with a binding of about that thickness. So to get it there, I'm going to take my ruler and mark out 4 centimetres from the edge with chalk. You can use a pencil or a pen if you want to. Just going to mark in a few places, the top and the bottom of the fabric, and essentially join the dots. I'm now going to cut up that line. So we've got our first little strip. If you know that you like to use binding quite a lot, you might like to cut up this whole section into bias pieces, just to save time when you're sewing other garments. And to do that, you can place the first one on top and use that as a guideline. Because these are formed through pressing, if they're a little bit wobbly, it doesn't matter too much. And then continue all the way up to get your bias strips. Once you've finished your cutting, I would recommend getting it all into a bundle and rolling it up neatly and tie it with a piece of scrap fabric so that when you're ready to start sewing, everything's here for you. If you're sewing at weekends or the evenings, it's nice to treat cutting as a separate task so that you come to the sewing section with a completely fresh mind and your pre-cut pieces. If you're going to be doing our online workshops, you will get your own pattern to cut at home, and you can use these techniques to prepare your fabric so that you're ready for starting your online course.